We can accelerate the end of this war, or we can cause it to last longer. And it looks like we've decided to postpone any fundamental change.
Now, in some respect, all anti-war dissidents have to acknowledge that a ceasefire is a good thing, right? Because people stop dying, at least for a time. But Colonel Douglas Macgregor recently went on Judge Napolitano's podcast and laid out the case in his mind why this US-backed ceasefire is actually not a good step on the pathway to actual peace, to actually ending this war. And as of now, Russia hasn't responded to the ceasefire, but Macgregor makes some interesting points here, so I just wanted to listen and react to them.
Colonel, in 1 week, Secretary of State Rubio announced a ceasefire to which the Ukrainians had agreed. President Trump announced the resumption of President Biden's military support by providing some military gear to Ukraine and American intel. And the Ukrainians dispatched hundreds of drones to attack a residential neighborhood in Moscow. What's going on?
I think the first thing is it's unfortunate that we continue to discuss our negotiations and interactions with the Russians in public. I don't see any point to it. And I think as a result, we're going to be embarrassed somewhat by this latest ceasefire offer. If there is anything the Russians have made clear repeatedly, it's that a ceasefire in and of itself is not acceptable. They see that as simply buying time for their Ukrainian opponent to receive more weapons, equipment, cash, whatever, rebuild themselves and carry on the fight. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's probably the case. So I don't know why we start with this ceasefire business. We say we want to save lives, but that's not the answer. The second thing, of course, is ending the aid. People say, well, it really doesn't matter. It'll take so long for the additional aid to reach Ukraine. What difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference if you're a Russian. If you are on the one hand saying, I want to normalize relations between my country, the United States, and Russia, I'm sincere and I'm serious about it, then why not stop the aid to people who are absolutely committed to killing Russians? That ought to be done right away. So I think that's a serious mistake. And again, this is not Donald Trump's war. He said that. He didn't want it. So why sustain the aid?
Good point. I mean, the ceasefire seems to sustain the aid, whereupon before it was withdrawn. And, you know, I have to hand it to him here. I think he makes a good point.
That doesn't make any sense. That's not a bargaining chip. That's a self-inflicted wound. It tends to undermine the sincerity and the truth of everything he's saying. And I do believe the president when he says he wants to end the war. That's not how you end it. So at the moment, I think we're going to be disappointed. I don't see anything happening that's good.
Is the United States a neutral in the communications between and negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? Because I think it's a co-belligerent with Ukraine.
Not only are we a co-belligerent, frankly, we're responsible for the existence of this heinous regime. The hundreds of drones that struck a residential area in Moscow would not have flown anywhere were it not for us. I think that this travesty that we somehow or another are brokering something between Kiev and Moscow ought to be ended immediately. We are mightily responsible for everything that's happened in Ukraine.
That's so true, and it goes back to the 90s, but the U.S. government was involved in the overthrow of a democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014, Yanukovych, who stood on a platform of neutrality. So there were so many steps along the line where this conflict could have been ended, but the U.S. government was complicit in it the whole way. the U.S. government is kind of using Ukraine as a pawn on a grand chessboard.
I think if you're a Russian, you reasonably ask the following question. If they want good relations with us, if they want to repair the damage, why don't they simply put an end to this regime in Kiev? And we could. And we could also demand that elections be held as soon as possible to put in a new government. And we could ask the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe to help with that and get rid of Zelensky and his crew. The fact that we're not doing any of those things sends the opposite signal to the Russians. It means we're not serious and we're not sincere.
We have any leverage with the Russians whatsoever?
No, of course not. Remember, we've made this analogy before, but we probably ought to do it again, Judge. If there were a large military establishment, force, 400, 500, 600, 700,000, whatever, sitting in Mexico that was armed, trained, and equipped by the Chinese or the Russians or anybody, and its sole purpose was to attack the United States, to regain control of southern Texas or southern California or something, based on what happened many, many years ago, what would we do?
And we know how the U.S. government responded to the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union was placing, nuclear missiles just off the coast of Florida. We know how the U.S. would respond to that.
We would smash it. We would stop it.
Right.
And we would not negotiate with it. It's an existential threat. And we need to understand that. We have no leverage whatsoever. No one would have leverage over us in the case that we were destroying a threat in Mexico.
So are Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Steve Witkoff on a fool's errand?
Oh, they're on Fantasy Island. There's no question about it.
Worse than a fool's errand, I guess. I don't know what they really think they can accomplish. Let me
I don't think they're going to accomplish much of anything. Although, to their credit, I think the Russians will still be polite to them.
What is your view of President Putin's methodical patience? I mean, he could have, I think you've told us this, if he wanted to, demolished the invaders in Kursk. He could also demolish the government buildings in Kyiv if he wanted to.
I think he's going to work diligently to achieve the aims of his campaign: denazification, demilitarization, and hopefully set the stage for a neutral Ukraine that does not have NATO forces or any foreign forces on its soil.
That was the Ukraine democratically elected in 2014 under Yanukovych. And I mean, for all these buffoons that say that, he's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union and, he's a new European Hitler that's going to invade Poland tomorrow, it's just none of that has borne out. So
we should welcome that. From the very beginning, a neutral Ukraine was in everyone's interest.
Amen.
It put this enormous barrier, 500, 600, 700 miles between us, between NATO and Russia, in a very positive way. The opportunity for any accidents or problems that could spill over the border are almost non-existent. So, this is what he's going to do. He's going to finish that to the extent that he can. And then at the same time, I think he's going to look to us to do what we just discussed. Get Zelensky out of the picture and his little supporting cast. Stop pretending they're legitimate. Stop pretending that we have nothing to do with them. We're just sponsoring them or supporting them. That's nonsense. Get rid of them. Hold some hasty elections to the best of their ability. Put a new government in there. Let's do that. That much will help enormously. And then it's time for all the states that border Ukraine to come on board and sign the neutrality treaty, which should be modeled on the Austrian state treaty. And we can certainly sign it, but we can't guarantee anything in perpetuity there because we don't live there.
Yeah, the U.S. doesn't have to be involved in redrawing the borders of Europe whatsoever, by the way. They can take care of that. The U.S. doesn't need to be involved. The true American first position is to just withdraw all aid. Get out of this nonsense. It's thousands of miles away. We don't need a nuclear power belligerent. We don't need to revive the Cold War.
But the people that do live in Europe, they can have a profound impact on the survival of the agreement once it's made.
How would you advise President Trump, if you were, please God, in a position to do so, handle the Europeans? I mean, you have Sir Keir Starmer, whose military, as you've told us, wouldn't even fill Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have President Emmanuel Macron, who does have nuclear weapons. The British nuclear weapons, I understand, are subject to approval by the Americans, some unique relationship we have with them. But how would you handle them? They seem to me to be profoundly ill-advised, a bit hot-headed, and I don't understand what they're trying to accomplish or even what they fear. But they're talking military action in Ukraine. Their people, in my view, would be blown to bits, but you're the military expert.
No, listen, you don't have to be an expert to understand that this is an empty threat. There's no support in their countries for military action against Russia. As I think I've said before, 86% of the people polled in Poland now oppose the use of Polish forces in Ukraine.
And that's for all the saber rattling in the EU and other, leaders that are talking about using European forces to fight in Ukraine. It is an empty threat.
Now, how are you going to get there to fight at all? It doesn't make any sense. So I think President Trump should cut his losses in Ukraine. He's a businessman. This was not an investment he made. It was made by his predecessor. It was a bad investment. Cut it.
I'm with Macgregor on that, but I just need to be clear and transparent here. Trump did approve about $300 million in aid, including military aid to Ukraine, and even under the threat of impeachment. They said, we'll impeach you if you don't send this payment. He ultimately sent the payment, and he still got impeached. And he's boasted about providing them with the javelins. Still, recently he's done that. So Macgregor's largely correct here, but just want to say Trump is slightly complicit in this for sure, although he was reluctant at one point.
Be done with it. Then turn around to the other partners and say, you're free to do whatever you think is best. That you have your sovereignty is yours. In other words, there's nothing in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that prohibits you from doing something stupid if that's what you want to do. But I'm telling you, as President of the United States, if you go in there with the objective of fighting the Russians, you're on your own. We don't want anything to do with it.
That is the America First position. Thank you. Amen.
We want good relations with Russia. You should too. I would leave it at that because these governments will not survive, Judge.
Do you think these leaders, and we'll take Starmer, Merz in Germany, and Macron as examples, go to bed at night worrying that they're going to be attacked in the morning, or you think this is all domestic, politically generated?
Well, they're globalists. They think that they are supporting what they consider to be a truly righteous cause, which I think is nihilism, atheism, socialism, all bound up together in ways that are catastrophic. I don't think the population support it. I think that's pretty obvious. I'd be surprised if the European Union survives this whole adventure. We know NATO won't. That's inevitable. And these
crossing my fingers on that one. Withdraw from NATO. No more entangling alliances. We don't need that.
things happen over time. It's better if you have some foresight and you can manage the dissolution of these things. But we don't live in the world of 80, 90 years ago. And the notion of building alliances or structuring anything that triggers an automatic war for the American people doesn't make any sense. So we definitely need to get out of these places. And I would just, if I were the president, I would simply say what I did. I don't think these governments will last. I think Starmer is on borrowed time. Macron is about as popular as the plague in France. I think the French and the British will dispose of them. Now, Matt's just got in there. And the Germans, as you know, these are very conservative people. And they will wait to see what he does. And they will discover that he is another globalist. He's another manifestation of the old problem. And the Germans will eventually throw him out. It just takes the Germans longer. Things usually begin in France, but they don't begin in Germany.
Here's Secretary of State Rubio in Ireland yesterday. I'd like your thoughts on this. Chris, cut number one.
Are you truly prepared to apply pressure on Russia should it be recalcitrant and not agree to the terms of this ceasefire? There's been no concrete action that this administration has taken to punish Russia since it's
Well,
come to
there's a couple points. To be clear, as far as I am aware, the United States has not provided armaments to Russia. The United States is not providing assistance to Russia. Every single sanction that has been imposed on Russia remains in place. Every single sanction the president inherited remains in place.
previous administration.
Right, but well, I mean, they're pretty sanctioned up. I mean, there's a lot of sanctions on already. My point being is that there's been no steps taken to relieve any of these things. These things continue to be in place, but we don't think it's constructive for me to stand here today and begin to issue threats about what we're going to do if Russia says no. Let's hope they say yes.
I just love how these corporate journalists always construe it as if the U.S. has not placed any pressure on Russia after supplying Ukraine with $200 billion of aid and armaments. It's just insane. They've loaded up that country with sanctions, which only really hurt the innocents there trying to get by for the most part, and it gives the regime, the Russian regime, an excuse to continue the war. So they're pretty under pressure right now.
Say yes to what? To giving the
Are you
30 days to regroup and rearm?
Yeah, exactly. I think Senator Rubio or Secretary of State Rubio is in a difficult position now. We have no leverage. Threatening the Russians with more of what we've already done is not going to have an impact. They have found a way to survive the sanctions regime. In fact, you can argue that they flourished as a result. We've actually strengthened this whole BRICS system that is evolving.
That is, I think, the biggest downside to U.S. intervention is Ukraine. We've put Russia into the arms of China, and a BRICS alliance is concerning, especially if they determine to create an alternative currency that replaces the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. He is so right about this. I'm so glad Macgregor's making this point.
By imposing sanctions, we are seen as so hostile and so belligerent. The view is that with the United States, it's their way or the highway. And the world doesn't want to play in that ballpark anymore. So the bottom line is he's telling you the truth. We've already done all that we can, and it doesn't make sense. They'll say yes. Well, that's a stupid remark because they're not going to say yes. We know what the conditions are. How many times do they have to repeat themselves? And we can help this along. We can accelerate the end of this war, or we can cause it to last longer. And it looks like we've decided to postpone any fundamental change and let it continue.
Well, it gets harder and harder to disagree with the opinions of people like Jeffrey Sachs and Douglas Macgregor, who are pretty skeptical about this ceasefire arrangement and this ceasefire deal because, as they kind of articulate, it's kind of an excuse to keep the flow of money and arms going, and really that might prolong the war in general. If the killing's just going to be guaranteed to be resuming, it's nice to have not killing for a while, but if it resumes, it might all be for naught. But I want to hear from you guys. Do you think this ceasefire arrangement is a good thing in terms of ending U.S. involvement in Ukraine or securing a peace with Russia? Let me know in a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And until the next time, our motto is no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. I'll catch you on the next one.